Thank you for joining me today. My name is Sean Egglestone and I'm a registered dietitian, and today I'm going to be giving my presentation on carbohydrates and whole grains. Now before we can actually talk about carbohydrates specifically, let's take a step back and look at macronutrients in general. So macronutrients are things that we need in large quantities, often grams, ounces, or pounds. The three most common macronutrients that we hear of are proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. And I have another nutrient density video where I talk about fiber and water and their importance in things like weight loss. So some of my other videos will expand on this topic. Micronutrients are needed in small quantities, often in milligrams or micrograms. Those are things like vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients or protective plant compounds that reduce our risk for chronic illness. Now, all plant foods have all three macronutrients, but meat only has two, protein and fat. There are no carbohydrates in meat. Dairy does have carbohydrates in the form of lactose sugar. And as mentioned above, fiber and water are found in large quantities in plant foods, but not so much in animal foods. In this slide, we see the different structures of the macronutrients. I don't expect you to memorize what they look like, but the basic understanding here is that because they look different, it allows them to function very differently. So when we think about the function of macronutrients, carbohydrates are energy rich. They're abundant in nature. We need them in large quantities for fuel, for exercise, and our brain runs on carbohydrates. And carbohydrates are also combined with fiber and phytonutrients that we mentioned before, and these are important for reducing our risk for chronic illness. Protein function for tissue repair, and they're important in chemical processes. Because of their molecular structure, it allows them to form very unique shapes that give them the ability to function in ways that carbohydrates and fats simply can't replace. Protein is essential for life. We only need about 10 to 15% of our calories minimum from protein. Now, animal protein comes packaged with things like cholesterol and saturated fat and heme iron, and it can be highly acidic and inflammatory. So if you want to learn more about plant versus animal proteins and their effect on our health, I highly recommend you check out my protein presentation that accompanies this. Fat, on the other hand, is very energy dense. We saw that there's all those different lines, if you will, on the fat structure, and each one of those can be broken apart for energy, and so there's a lot of energy in a small space in fat molecules. Fat is important for cell structure and support, warmth, and protection of our organs. Now, most foods that are high in fat, again, like protein, tend to have compounds like cholesterol and saturated fat, and they don't have fiber or phytonutrients. So I also recommend you check out my fat presentation that will expand on this as well. And if you're interested in the ketogenic diet or want to learn more about it, I have a paper on my website, seantherd.com, that discusses the ketogenic diet and the health consequences associated with consuming diets high in fat. Now, what are carbohydrates? Carbohydrates are a major source of energy. There's fiber packaged with them. Sources include fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, peas, chickpeas, lentils. Now, carbs, with the exception of milk, only come from plants. Animal products do not contain carbohydrates. So, eggs, meat, fish, there's no carbs in those at all. There's no fiber in those. Fiber is a type of carbohydrate, and we'll be talking about that later. Now, there's 4 calories per gram in carbohydrates, and this term we will expand upon in my other presentation on nutrient density and weight loss. So real quick, let's talk about starches. So if carbohydrates can be thought of as a large umbrella. Under that term, carbohydrates are different types of carbohydrates. So we have starches. Starches are complex carbohydrates. So if you think of sugar as a paperclip, then if you put those paper clips together in a big chain, you'll get starches. So it's a big branched paperclip chain, if you will. Now, on the other end of that spectrum is things like sugar and fruit. Those contain, well, simple sugars, individual paper clips. And when we link them together, we get starches and grains. Grains are a type of starch. So starches include, for example, these examples on the right-hand side under the green arrow: wheat, rice, oats, corn, quinoa, barley. Those are a specific type of starch called a grain. A grain is a seed from a crop. Now, starches also include things like potatoes and starchy vegetables like carrots, but we're not going to talk about them in this slide. We're going to talk about grains, starches being grains. Now, the best kind of grains to consume, especially if you have diabetes, are what we call intact grains. Things like wheat berries, brown rice, oats, corn, quinoa, barley. These are grains that are intact and can be found in the bulk bin section in the grocery store, and they appear just as they grew from the field, or just as a farmer would pick them. So these are what we would call healthy carbohydrates. Now, when they're milled into a flour, we can get whole grain products. So things like whole wheat bread, brown rice flour, oat flour. So they use oat flour to make Cheerios, cornmeal to make cornbread muffins, and whole wheat to make whole wheat pasta and crackers. Now, when we mill grains into flour, they're going to digest quicker. And that's not necessarily good, because if we have diabetes, we want our carbohydrates to digest as slow as possible. So I recommend individuals in that circumstance consume most of their carbohydrates from intact grains. Whole grains are considered good, but not as good as intact grains. And then bad carbohydrates, these are refined grains or refined flours like white flour and sugar and white pasta, white rice. In the top right, you'll see a photo. That's what a grain looks like. The bran, if you've ever heard of the term wheat bran or wheat germ. So bran is that outer fibrous covering. So if you get wheat bran, that's high in fiber. If you get wheat germ, that's the fatty portion that often gets removed in the milling or the refining process. That increases the shelf life, and the germ is what can go rancid. That fat can go rancid. So, and then when we look at white flours have the bran and the germ removed, and it's just that starchy endosperm, that inner carbohydrate, without the vitamins, minerals, and fiber that's associated with an intact grain or a whole grain. But I heard carbohydrates are bad. So carbohydrates are some of the best food sources because they're often combined with fiber and water. So when you make oatmeal, it binds to water and it's high in fiber. These things fill you up without adding calories and can promote weight loss. Carbohydrates are also high in vitamins, carotenoids, these phytochemicals, plant chemicals that reduce our risk for things like colon cancer and breast cancer and heart disease. They're also high in magnesium, potassium, B vitamins, trace minerals like selenium and zinc, and that fiber acts as a prebiotic to feed our good gut bacteria. They're also a great source of water when they absorb water in the cooking process. These are what we call good carbohydrates. And bad carbohydrates are the ones that don't look like you would find them either at a farmer's market, a farm stand, or grown in a field. These are things like chips, crackers, cookies, desserts made from sugar. These are what we call bad carbohydrates. They digest quickly, and they can promote chronic illness. So the best way to tell if a carbohydrate is good or bad is eat it the way that it grew out of the garden or out of the field. You want your food to come as close to nature as possible with minimal processing. The intact carbohydrates are the best. Whole grains are good, and the refined grains and refined carbohydrates with the added sugars, those are the ones that we need to watch out for. Oftentimes we hear that carbohydrates are bad, or that people are limiting carbohydrates, or people are following a low carbohydrate diet. Remember, carbohydrates, with the exception of milk, only come from plant foods. So when we limit carbohydrates in our diet, we're limiting plant foods in our diet. And that's a big problem because the majority of our antioxidants, our vitamins, minerals, fiber, and other compounds that protect us and reduce our risk for chronic disease like stroke and cancer and diabetes and heart disease and dementia. These compounds are found in foods that are high in carbohydrates like vegetables and fruits and beans. So what we find is that the healthiest populations around the world are ones that have diets that are centered around carbohydrates, or they're centered around whole plant-based foods. I touch on this topic more in my presentation called How to Live to Be 100, Blue Zone presentation. You can find that on my website, and towards the end of that presentation, you'll find a lot of recommendations on what exactly is a heart-healthy diet and what to eat. The healthfulness of any diet, generally speaking, comes from the ratio of plant foods to animal foods. So this is a rough estimate, but I recommend that most people, for optimal health, have at least 75% of their food come from plants, whole plant sources like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, beans, peas, chickpeas, lentils, nuts, and seeds. And then if they do have animal products in their diet, that it doesn't exceed 25%. To limit carbohydrates means to limit plant foods, limit fiber, and limit antioxidants, oftentimes at the expense of increasing our fat, cholesterol, and pro-oxidant intake. But I have diabetes. Carbohydrates make my blood sugars go too high. So if you want to learn more about carbohydrates and diet and diabetes and how to reverse or prevent or manage your blood sugars better, go on over to my website, SeanTheRD.com, and there's a drop-down menu, Educate Yourself and How-To videos, and that's where you're going to find my proteins, fats, and carbs videos, my weight loss videos, my nutrient density videos, my Blue Zone videos, and this is also where you're going to find the diabetes video as well. Now, diabetes, really briefly, is a disease of carbohydrate intolerance. It's not necessarily caused by eating too many carbohydrates. Diabetes is actually caused by microscopic fat that gets deposited in our organs and our muscles and makes our body resistant to utilizing our blood sugars. It's not necessarily caused by an intake of too many carbohydrates, but again, I touch on this in much greater detail in my presentation. Now, I'm not going to go over this slide in great detail, but what this slide shows is all the different benefits that fiber can have on body weight reduction. So generally speaking, carbohydrate-rich foods are high in fiber. This fiber helps bind to toxins in our intestines. It adds bulk and weight and volume to our food, which causes satiety. It decreases our intake of calories and has a whole bunch of hormonal effects on our body that can help promote weight loss. This is just another different diagram that shows all the different effects that dietary fiber has on our diet and how this can improve our body weight. And that's important because when we have a healthy body weight, it helps reduce our risk for chronic illness. Now, label reading. How do we put all this into practice? So the product here on the left-hand side is a white pasta, and the reason we know that is because when we look in the ingredient label, it doesn't say whole wheat. It just says wheat or durum wheat flour. On the product on the right, not only on the front will these products often say whole grain or whole wheat, but in the ingredient label, I make sure that that first ingredient says whole, W-H-O-L-E. This is another example of how do I tell if a food is refined or not. So the product on the left looks appealing. It says certified 100% organic hard red spring wheat. So you might pick that up thinking that's a good product, but that's basically white flour because it doesn't say the word whole. The product on the right says organic whole grain soft wheat flour. So that's a whole grain product. And that's important because when you remember back on the slide where we looked at wheat bran, germ, and the endosperm, so whole grain or whole grain flour is going to contain all three of those parts, whereas flour that's not whole is often just the starchy endosperm of the grain. Next couple slides are going to be meal ideas. This is what I have every day for breakfast. So it's a bowl of oatmeal with some flaxseed, some cinnamon, and a variety of berries. You'll see on the right hand side the label. You'll find that this is a high carbohydrate meal, but it's also high in fiber, 13 grams of fiber. So my current recommendation is that men and women get at least 40 grams of fiber per day. We know that fiber, the more fiber we take in, the lower our risk of heart disease, because fiber helps to bind to toxins, it fills you up, you eat less calories, it binds to cholesterol so you don't absorb it, so in effect it helps lower your cholesterol levels. If I don't do oatmeal, then I'll have a smoothie, and I have a whole YouTube channel called Feeling Fit, and it just goes over, for the most part, all of my smoothie videos and smoothie recipes, and I also post a lot of the videos on my website, also on Feeling Fit. This is another example of a lunch that I might have. It's some rice, beans, corn, peas, a potato, and what we'll see is that for this whole big plate of food, I'm getting about 600 calories, but I'm getting 17 grams of fiber. So between breakfast and lunch, I'm getting 30 grams of fiber alone, so it's going to be no problem for me to get at least 40 grams of fiber per day. Now, along with those carbohydrates, I'm getting a lot of bright colors, reds and greens and yellows, and these are full of antioxidants and protective compounds. This is another example of a meal. Here we have a black bean burger, we have a cornbread muffin, we have an acorn squash filled with vegetables, and some pasta salad. Now, you can find that it's got 130 grams of carbohydrates, a whopping 23 grams of fiber. The one change I would make to this meal is that the pasta isn't whole grain. That's a white pasta. So if we switch that pasta out for whole wheat pasta, that would be a great improvement. Now you'll notice that the sodium's high. It's almost 1,000 milligrams. And most of the reason for that is that black bean burger and the cornbread muffin. So I would get rid of the cornbread muffin first, and then that burger is going to have some sodium in it as well. This is another example of a lunch. Now this wouldn't hold me very long. It only has 300 calories, but this is a good example of the power of carbohydrates. You can have a whole plate full of food and not even break 300 calories. Here we have 54 grams of carbs. I don't really count carbs per se, but what I do count is grams of fiber. That's 13 grams of fiber and not a lot of calories. This last slide here, we have some beans again, some rice underneath the vegetables. There's going to be about 600 calories. So what you're finding is that my lunches are around 600 calories. I'm getting over 100 grams of carbohydrates, and I'm getting somewhere between 15 to 20 grams of fiber. So thank you for joining me today. I hope you found this presentation beneficial. If you have any questions, you can contact me on my website, SeanTheRD.com. If you haven't checked out my other 2 macronutrient videos on proteins and fats, I highly recommend you do that. And again, on my website, you can go over to Educate Yourself How-To videos and find all of my nutrition education videos, and they all build on each other. So watch them all at least once, and you'll have a great understanding of nutrition.